I've been on the road for the last 2 hours, heading to the Marriott in Baltimore where my wife, Laura, is attending a conference. The plan was to surprise her, maybe take her out for dinner. Yeah, that was the idea anyway. But let's be real, things haven't been feeling right lately. Over the past 3 months, I've had this gut feeling that Laura might be having an affair with one of her coworkers. Every time she went away on a business trip or to some conference, she'd always come back later than expected. Tonight, I figured I'd finally catch her in the act and put an end to all the doubts and suspicions. Laura and I have been married for 14 years, with two great kids, 12-year-old Emily and 10-year-old Luke, who are currently staying with my mom. We got married right out of high school after dating for the last 2 years. Laura's always been stunning, with her long brown hair, slender figure, and strong features. She was bright, cheerful, everything seemed perfect, until about 3 months ago. Before then, I thought we had a solid marriage, but lately it felt like something was off. Little things started adding up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I didn't want to confront her directly, though. I didn't want to come off like some paranoid, jealous husband. Today, the timing worked out. The conference was nearby, so I had the perfect chance to drop by unannounced and maybe catch her red-handed. At the hotel counter, I handed over my suit bag and introduced myself as Mark Davis. I told the clerk that Laura was attending the insurance conference and that I'd been informed I could pick up a key to room 214. After confirming my identity, the clerk handed me the key, and I made my way to the elevator, my mind racing with questions about what to do when I finally caught her. Should I knock? Should I walk in? Would she be alone? I wasn't sure what to expect, but I knew I had to act fast. As I walked down the hall, I made up my mind to use the key to open the door and see what was happening. Trying to be quiet, I unlocked the door, swung it open, and there she was, sitting at the desk with her briefcase open, working on some paperwork. She turned around, eyes wide in surprise, letting out a gasp at my unexpected arrival. I played it cool, telling her I had some free time and thought I'd drop by to take her out to dinner. Laura seemed happy to see me, even assuming I'd be staying the night and welcoming the idea of some company. She walked over, gave me a big kiss. In that moment, I realized that my plan to catch her cheating had fallen apart. Trying to play it off, I asked if we could have a quick moment before dinner. She suggested we could have a little fun before her shower, promising me a night of whatever I wanted afterward. I was relieved that my suspicions seemed to be wrong, glad that I hadn't lost the woman I loved. We shared a brief, intimate moment, and then with a grin, Laura headed for the bathroom to shower. I took a seat on the bed, still trying to process everything. Her toiletry case was sitting on the dresser, and I decided to rummage through it for some aspirin, hoping to ease the headache from the long drive. I didn't find any, but something else caught my eye. In the side pocket of her case, I noticed a pack of 6 contraceptives. I stared at them for a moment, not sure what to make of it. After Luke was born, Laura switched to birth control pills that made her sick, so I'd gone ahead and gotten a vasectomy. We hadn't used any contraception since then, so why the hell were these in her bag? I wasn't an idiot. It didn't take long for the conclusion to hit me. Laura was definitely cheating on me. I was angry, but I didn't know what to do next. I kept digging through her bag, finding safety pins, something she kept in case of clothing emergencies. I took one and carefully punctured each condom, replacing them as I found them, all while she was still in the shower. Then I called up my friend Connor and asked him to do me a favor. He agreed without hesitation. I needed him to call me in about an hour, saying there was an emergency at school, a burst pipe or something, and I had to rush back. Connor said he'd make the call at 7. I didn't want to spend the night with Laura anymore, especially after what I just found. I regretted how things had gone down and just wanted to leave. The drive home was going to be a long one, and I knew I needed to take some sort of action, but I wasn't sure what yet. As Laura came out of the shower, I had to bite my tongue, holding back the urge to confront her. I was burning inside, but I kept my cool. I didn't want to let her know that I knew what she was up to. By the time we sat down for dinner, I was in a dark place. I told her to order whatever she wanted since it was all on me. She wasn't very hungry, though, and ordered a small filet, suggesting a bottle of rosé to go with it. As we ate, I couldn't help myself. I had to ask. I asked her if she was happy with our marriage. She gave a simple, positive answer. She talked about how great our home was, how she had two wonderful kids, and a husband who loved her. She said she couldn't ask for anything more. I shared some of my own doubts, wondering if I was doing everything I could to make her happy, telling her how lucky I felt to have her, how I had to pinch myself to believe it sometimes. Laura reassured me, calling me a silly goose, and acknowledging that that's why I'd driven all the way down to see her. She told me not to worry, that she was happy, and that I was doing all the right things. She even said that a woman couldn't ask for a better husband. Dinner went on and we made small talk. As the plates were cleared, my phone rang. I excused myself and stepped out to the lobby to avoid disturbing the other diners. A few minutes later, I came back and told Laura that Connor had called, saying there was a water pipe issue at the school. I apologized, told her I needed to leave immediately, and ended up canceling the rest of the night. Laura looked disappointed, but it was hard for me to tell if it was real. Honestly, I couldn't tell if staying or leaving mattered to her at all. Either way, she was going to have to face the consequences. As I got onto the elevator, a guy named Ryan Williams stepped off. He greeted Laura and mentioned he had stopped by her room for dinner, but she hadn't answered. He introduced himself and told me that Laura talks about me all the time. I explained to Ryan that I'd come down for the night but had to head back home because of an unexpected emergency. Shaking his hand and forcing a smile was harder than I thought, but I managed to keep up the act. Once Laura and I were alone in the elevator, I brought up something that had been gnawing at me for a while. I told her I really wanted her to quit her job. Working with Ryan just made me uncomfortable, and I didn't feel right about it. I reminded her we'd talked about this before, and it was important to me. Laura brushed it off, saying she had no plans to quit. She said she enjoyed her job and was learning a lot from Ryan. She added almost dismissively that I needed to get over my paranoia about her and Ryan. She gave me a quick kiss when we got back to the room, but I could hardly feel it. I grabbed my bags and hit the road, heading back home. The whole drive back, I couldn't stop thinking about Ryan dropping by her room. By the time I got home, I was a wreck. I was angry, frustrated, even feeling a growing hatred for Laura and what she was doing to our marriage. I wished I knew the tricks that private investigators use to catch cheaters, but I was clueless. What could I do? Divorce felt like the only way out, but without concrete evidence, I was stuck, forced to keep up appearances, while inside I felt shattered. 2 days later, Laura came home, cheerful and seemingly carefree, which only made my resentment worse. I checked her bag and found a single condom left, still with that tiny hole I'd punctured. On Saturday, we attended the Globies Insurance Company picnic. The kids had a blast, but I dreaded the whole day, suspecting that some of her colleagues probably knew what was going on. I felt exposed, trying to keep a low profile to avoid being the target of jokes. Maybe I was a little paranoid, but the thought wouldn't leave me alone. Laura, meanwhile, seemed to be enjoying herself, laughing and socializing with Ryan and others. Although they weren't openly affectionate, the two of them seemed close. Too close. I didn't care. Being ignored suited me just fine. A woman approached me, introducing herself as Sophie Williams. She was striking, with long auburn hair and big blue eyes, looking like she'd just stepped out of a magazine. For a moment, I was completely thrown off. I thought highly of my wife and still loved her, but Sophie looked stunning. I couldn't help but wonder why Ryan would even think about cheating on someone like her. After we exchanged introductions, we decided to find a quieter spot to talk. We ended up on some benches by the lake, a good distance from the crowd. I offered to listen if there was something on her mind. She hesitated, clearly struggling with her words. And that's when I knew she was aware of the affair. To make it easier, I told her that I'd recently found out too. She seemed relieved and admitted she'd known for a couple of months. Sophie explained that she was planning to serve Ryan with divorce papers and had already hired a detective to gather proof. Her lawyer had mentioned that if Laura was willing to testify or sign a notarized statement, it would strengthen her case. Curious, I asked about the type of proof she had. Sophie said she had photos and taped phone conversations, and while she didn't have video footage yet, the photos alone were convincing. She had dates and times, enough evidence to build a solid case. Sophie offered to work together, asking if my lawyer could use the same evidence. She also mentioned she was pursuing legal action against Globies, saying that some company officials knew about the affair but did nothing to stop it. She'd given them an ultimatum, fire both Ryan and Laura, or face a $1 million lawsuit. Before we wrapped up, Sophie suggested we meet at her place the next day while Ryan was out golfing. She said we could go over her evidence together and figure out our next steps. I agreed, feeling like maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of this mess after all. The next morning, as expected, Laura told me she'd be out for a few hours. Once she left, I dropped the kids off at my mom's and headed to Sophie's place. She welcomed me at the door and led me to the den, where a large computer monitor sat on the table. To my surprise, it displayed a live feed of an empty motel room. Sophie offered me a drink, and I opted for a Pepsi. She explained that in a few minutes, we'd be watching her husband play a round of golf, except the golf would actually be a rendezvous with Laura. I asked how she'd managed to set this up, and she revealed she'd spent $1,400 to arrange the surveillance, which she intended to have Ryan cover in the divorce. The whole thing was going to be recorded, and she offered to give me a DVD copy once it was done. She admitted she didn't really want to watch, but she couldn't look away either. We passed the time chatting for about 20 minutes. Sophie filled me in on some of the details she'd gathered about the affair, showing me photos, tapes, and documents that left me feeling equal parts amazed and crushed. There was no denying Laura's betrayal now. It was all right there. Then, just as Sophie predicted, Ryan and Laura entered the room on the monitor. They didn't waste any time, immediately undressing without a single word. The image was sharp, though the audio was somewhat garbled. Watching my wife and another man together left me feeling hollow. Sophie, on the other hand, simply commented, "Wow, you don't see a body like that very often." I forced a smile but didn't know what to say. The scene unfolding before us was more than I could bear. After a few minutes, I turned to Sophie and admitted that watching this was uncomfortable for me. She agreed, saying we didn't have to sit through the whole thing. "To be honest," I said, "this is pretty unbearable. I don't think I need to watch it all. It's all being recorded for the lawyers anyway." I got the sense that Sophie felt the same, and she suggested we go look at her koi pond out back instead. Her face lit up as she led the way, clearly excited that I'd taken an interest in her hobby. As we stepped outside, I couldn't help but think that while Laura was busy in that motel room, I was actually going to have a better afternoon than she was. The 3 koi ponds were stunning, and I found myself especially fascinated by the intricate pumping and filter systems. Before my job at the school, I'd worked as a plumber, so it was easy to get drawn into the mechanics of it all. Sophie shared that Ryan had never lifted a finger to help with her hobby, forcing her to hire people whenever there was an issue with the pipes or pumps. I offered to lend a hand anytime Ryan was off golfing, not for any romantic reasons, but because I genuinely wanted to learn more about the koi ponds. Spending time with Sophie was just a pleasant bonus. After a few hours that flew by, we returned to her house. The motel room feed showed that it was empty, which meant it was time for me to head home. Sophie promised to let me know when Ryan had his next golf game so I could bring Emily and Luke over to visit the koi lady. Over the following weeks, each time Laura showered, I'd check her bag and find a fresh supply of contraceptives. I couldn't fathom how quickly she was going through them or when she found the time. I kept a safety pin on my keychain, ready to puncture each new batch, expecting that Laura might soon announce a sudden visit to her sisters. On evenings after Ryan's golf games, the kids would excitedly tell Laura about their time with the koi lady, showing her fish drawings and sharing the names they'd given the koi. Laura seemed oblivious to the connection with Ryan's wife, even relieved that I kept the kids entertained while she was busy. Twice I tried to convince her to quit her job and cut ties with Ryan, but each attempt ended in a harsh rejection. The second time with biting remarks that left me stung, but made it easier to justify my actions. I began avoiding intimacy with her, only to be met with digs questioning my masculinity. It hurt, but it strengthened my resolve. Then on a Tuesday night, Laura dropped a bombshell. She said she'd been feeling overwhelmed and wanted to take a few days off to visit her sister for about a week. She acknowledged how hard I'd been working, even suggesting that I needed the time to unwind. Laura assured me she'd take care of things so I could enjoy myself, clearly assuming that a trip to my sister's would be the perfect fix for any marital tension. I hardly slept that night, preoccupied with the steps I needed to take. Finally, the time had come. Laura's sister Claire and her husband Ian lived 3 hours away. Ian was all right, but he could be clueless, especially when Claire called the shots. Their town conveniently had 2 termination clinics, and I'd already gathered their addresses, hours, and policies. Knowing they each required a 2-day cooling-off period, I calculated that if Laura's first appointment was Wednesday, the procedure would be Friday, giving her time to recover before coming home. This left me with a day and a half to set everything in motion. The morning Laura left, I started organizing. I explained the situation to my parents, admitting my failings as a husband, and they understood, offering their support. The kids were happy to stay with my folks, and my dad's truck would come in handy for moving Laura's things. I also coordinated with my lawyer, who would have all the necessary paperwork ready by Thursday morning. Sophie's lawyer was similarly prepared, and we'd planned to serve Ryan and Laura simultaneously. As Thursday dawned, Dad and I spent the morning packing up Laura's belongings. Then after a 3-hour drive, I reached the first clinic only to be disappointed. It was a dead end. My last option was the Family Planning Center. Steeling myself, I approached the receptionist, introduced myself as Mark Davis, and told her my wife Laura had asked me to come in and sign a consent form. I feigned some uncertainty about the form's specifics, saying it was something about understanding and agreeing to the procedure with no intent to sue. The receptionist found Laura's file and mentioned that her sister had already signed, but added that my signature would be preferred. After a quick computer check, she retrieved the file, and I signed just below Claire's name. I couldn't help but notice the appointment was set for Friday at 11 a.m. and required her to be there an hour early. I offered to cover any remaining fees, but the receptionist assured me that Laura had already paid the full $800 in cash. I thanked her, grateful for how smoothly it had gone. When I arrived at Claire and Ian's, the reception was laughably forced. Laura acted surprised, asking why I was there, and I replied that I'd taken some sick leave to relax, leaving the kids with my parents. The room fell silent, and I could almost see them scrambling to figure out how to handle my unannounced arrival. Claire gave Ian a subtle nod, signaling him to join her in the kitchen, while Laura tried to steer the conversation toward trivial topics. After a few minutes, Ian returned with a suggestion. Why not spend the next day on the lake with his buddy Adam's bass boat so we wouldn't be bothering the ladies? I agreed, playing along, and even suggested Adam join us, to which Ian readily agreed. Relieved by how things had unfolded, we had a quiet dinner, though there was a noticeable distance between Laura and me. Early the next morning, Adam was waiting with the boat, and Ian packed a cooler with lunch and plenty of beer. As we loaded up, Ian asked if I was getting in. Standing by the passenger door, I calmly told him I'd changed my mind and suggested he make the most of his day because facing Claire later wouldn't be easy. Ian tried for 5 solid minutes to convince me, but I had to get firm. After a few choice words and pointed threats, he got the message. I watched Ian and Adam leave without me, knowing it was only a matter of time before things would come crashing down for everyone. Adam and Ian took off, and I went back inside, poured myself a cup of coffee, and turned off Claire's cell phone. Then I called my dad, who was always up early, and we ended up chatting for a solid 2 hours, ignoring the constant call waiting tones. Ian must have been trying to reach Claire for hours. When Claire and Laura finally woke up, I wrapped up the call with my dad and braced myself for the confrontation. I cleared all the missed calls on the landline and turned Claire's cell phone back on. They had less than 2 hours until they needed to be at the Family Planning Center. I brewed a fresh pot of coffee, ready for the fireworks. As Laura spotted me, she was instantly on edge, demanding to know what I was doing there. I explained that I wasn't feeling up to fishing, so I figured I'd stick around for the day with them. I suggested we find a nice place for lunch, mentioning that I'd be heading back that night and didn't want to spend the day on a boat with Ian and Adam. Laura was quick to shoot that down, saying she and Claire had their own plans for the day. She reminded me she only got to see Claire a few times a year and pointed out that I'd have the rest of the week to spend with her. I kept pushing, pointing out that I'd driven all the way here and could at least spend half a day with her. Claire slipped out of the room, dialing her phone. Laura sank into a chair, looking as if she'd been hit by a truck. Meanwhile, we could hear Claire's voice raised in a fury, yelling at Ian like he'd committed some grand betrayal. I almost felt bad for him, but he did marry her after all. Laura turned to me, frustrated, insisting she didn't want me tagging along. They'd made plans and they didn't include me. I suggested she tell me what they had planned so I could decide if I was interested or would find something else to occupy myself with. With a smirk, I asked if they were meeting some guys or something. Laura scoffed, saying it was just shopping, for private things like lingerie. She assured me they weren't interested in dragging a guy along while they shopped for bras and nightgowns. I shrugged, saying I could wait outside the dressing rooms and do my own thing around the mall while they browsed. I even promised to take them somewhere fancy for lunch to make up for the trouble. Right then, Claire appeared in the doorway, glaring. Laura looked like she was ready to give in, seeing I wasn't about to back down. Reluctantly, she got up, mumbling something about getting dressed. Claire shot me a nasty look, calling me a real bonehead, before following Laura upstairs. After about 20 minutes, the landline lit up, signaling someone was making a call from upstairs. The clock was ticking, and they only had about an hour to get to the clinic. I figured if they tried to slip out without me, I'd follow and make sure they knew it. But I doubted they'd risk that. When they finally came downstairs, Laura, with a bit of an attitude, announced it was time to go shopping. I could tell they'd reluctantly decided to go along with me, rather than try sneaking off. We piled into my car because I insisted on driving. No way I'd let them ditch me somewhere. At the gas station, I took my time, filling up the tank, checking the oil, and cleaning the windshield. I could feel them fuming in the car. When we reached the mall, I parked far out so we'd have a long walk to the entrance. Once inside, I let them go about their business while I kept a loose watch, staying nearby but not hovering. They didn't seem to be enjoying themselves, and I didn't care one bit. They whispered and gestured to each other, clearly frustrated. They even bought a few things just to make it seem like they'd been shopping. The time for their appointment came and went. I'd successfully stalled their plans. I knew Laura would reschedule eventually, but I'd at least thrown a wrench into things for now. When we regrouped at the mall's center court, I took them out to the Olive Garden for lunch. By the time we got back to the house around 2 p.m., there was hardly any conversation, just the satisfaction on my end of having thrown them off. I grabbed a beer and sank into the sofa, smiling to myself. Laura and Claire were clearly irritated, but it didn't bother me at all. It felt good, honestly. Later, Ian showed up, and Claire wasted no time berating him for a solid 30 minutes. The poor guy managed to escape for a couple of hours before returning for supper. After dinner, I asked Laura for a private conversation in the kitchen. Claire sneered as she and Laura walked into the living room. Laura still looked upset over the morning's events, and I sensed she'd be difficult. I got right to the point, saying I wanted her to quit her job and cut ties with Ryan Williams. She clenched her teeth, struggling to keep from lashing out, and told me she didn't want to hear it again. Laura made it clear that she wasn't going to waste her time explaining herself, that I already knew her answer, and it hadn't changed. She gave me an ultimatum: either change the topic or leave. Without a word, I reached into my bag and pulled out a manila envelope. I told her I'd asked her 10 times in the past 2 months, and every time she'd refused. Inside was a legal envelope with divorce papers, along with a self-addressed, stamped envelope to mail them back in. I told her she could have a lawyer look them over if she wanted. Her face hardened as she leaned across the table, saying I had no grounds for divorce just because I didn't like her job or her choice of friends. Laura folded her arms and stated that without grounds, this wouldn't go anywhere. She suggested Adam and Ian headed off while I went inside, poured myself a cup of coffee, and shut off Claire's cell phone. I then called my dad, who was always an early riser, and we talked for about 2 hours, ignoring the call-waiting beeps. Ian must have tried to get hold of Claire for hours. As Claire and Laura eventually got up, I ended the call with my dad, anticipating the upcoming confrontation. I cleared the missed calls on the landline and switched Claire's cell phone back on. In less than 2 hours, Claire and Laura would need to be at the family planning center. Bracing myself for the inevitable, I made a fresh pot of coffee for both of them. Laura, still groggy, looked at me and asked, "What are you even doing here?" I casually replied that I wasn't in the mood for fishing and decided I'd spend the day with them instead. I suggested we grab a nice lunch together since I'd be heading out that evening. Laura flatly refused, saying she and Claire had plans and didn't want me tagging along. She emphasized that she could see me anytime, but only got to see Claire a couple of times a year. She also reminded me that I'd be around all week. I pushed back a little, saying she could spare me half a day since I'd driven all the way down here, promising I wouldn't hover. Claire walked out of the room, dialing her phone, while Laura just sat there, visibly frustrated. We could soon hear Claire yelling at Ian as if he'd committed a cardinal sin. I felt a pang of sympathy for him. He did marry her, after all. Laura finally made it clear that neither she nor Claire wanted me joining them. I agreed to hear their plans, offering to make my own if I wasn't interested. Trying to lighten the tension, I asked jokingly if they were meeting up with guys. Laura rolled her eyes, explaining they'd planned to go shopping for things like bras, underwear, and nightgowns, items they didn't want anyone around for while trying on. I suggested I could keep myself occupied elsewhere in the mall and wouldn't hover. Just then, Claire re-entered, throwing me a hard glare. Laura sighed, seeming to accept that I wasn't going to back down, and reluctantly agreed to go get dressed. As they went upstairs, Claire shot me a final scowl, calling me a real bonehead. I waited as they took their time, even noticing the landline lit up, indicating they'd made a call, likely rescheduling the appointment. 20 minutes later, they returned, dressed and begrudgingly ready to go. I insisted on taking my car and made a point of stopping to fill up the gas tank, check the oil, and clean the windshield while they simmered. When we reached the mall, I parked at the far end, ensuring a decent walk-in. Once inside, I gave them space, only keeping a distant eye on them. They seemed tense, whispering and gesturing as if on edge. The clock ticked past their appointment time, and I silently celebrated my minor victory in delaying things. They eventually met me at the mall's center court, and we went to the Olive Garden for lunch. Back at the house later, I relaxed with a beer while Ian finally arrived. Claire unleashed a verbal assault on him for nearly half an hour before he slipped out to regroup, returning later for dinner. After supper, I asked to speak privately with Laura in the kitchen. She was still seething, clearly upset by the day's events. I got straight to the point, expressing that I wanted her to quit her job and stop seeing Ryan Williams. Laura's jaw clenched, and she struggled to control her anger, stating firmly that she'd had enough of my demands. She reminded me that I'd brought this up repeatedly and that her answer wouldn't change. She even gave me an ultimatum to drop it or leave. In response, I calmly reached into a manila envelope and took out a set of photos, laying out 6 pictures of her with Ryan on the table. Laura's face froze as she took in the images, but she didn't respond. I continued, placing more photos on the table until she snapped, screaming at me to stop. She accused me of spying, calling me sneaky and even perverted, saying I made her sick. My phone rang, interrupting the chaos. It was my dad, letting me know he'd be there in 10 minutes with Laura's belongings. Hanging up, I informed her of the call, explaining that the locks had been changed and that my dad would bring her things to Claire's place. I handed her the title to her car, signed over, and an envelope with half the money from our accounts, around $200. I detailed the arrangements for her visitation rights with the kids, noting the option for overnight stays if she signed a statement about the affair. Notarized. I even mentioned having a DVD from her last motel visit with Ryan, which recorded everything the photos showed. Laura seethed, calling me a miserable weasel, condemning my actions as the most despicable thing she'd ever heard. I retorted, stating the true betrayal lay in her affair. At that moment, my dad pulled up outside, so I told her goodbye, wishing her well with her upcoming appointment. For the first time, I saw her eyes well up with tears as I walked out. Claire rushed in to console her, and Ian joined me outside. Ian tried to defend her, saying I couldn't just throw away a 14-year marriage over a misunderstanding. I cut him off, asking bluntly why Laura had come down to visit him and Claire in the first place. He looked down, seemingly embarrassed, and mumbled an apology. After that, I didn't hear from Laura again. She didn't visit the kids, who didn't seem to mind, as they were forming a strong bond with Sophie, a woman I'd started seeing who cared deeply for my kids. We spent time together, but no intimacy occurred. We didn't want to complicate the divorce process. Months later, Ryan was let go from his job, and Laura refused to sign the affidavit, though my lawyer assured me we had enough without it. By Christmas, both divorces were final. Laura showed up to see the kids, bringing gifts and staying a couple of hours, but we didn't discuss the affair or the divorce. I listed the house for sale, and within a few months, Sophie and I moved in together. As for Ryan and Laura, he took a job in Omaha, but shortly after, he left without a word, and Laura moved back in with Claire, whose husband had filed for divorce. Sophie and I grew closer, sharing an easy, contented life with the kids. We planned to marry in June, savoring every moment and building the happy life I'd always envisioned. I told Lily, rather bluntly, that I found it hard to return to our old intimate routines, even more so after a year of disconnect. Then I threw in the shocker. I'd sold the Jaguar a year ago. Her face dropped, her disbelief evident as she sputtered about how I could sell the car I'd poured hours into restoring. I shrugged, mentioning it had been a while since she paid any attention to my life. She was stunned and, trying to make amends, suggested using money from the family business or her trust to buy another one. I declined, noting that it wasn't for sale, and she blinked, asking where the money for that would even come from. I reminded her that she'd signed off on her trust fund months ago. I'd put that money toward down payments on houses for our kids. Lily looked dumbfounded and muttered, almost to herself, if that's where the money had gone. I confirmed, mentioning that I'd told her about it at the time, though she'd been pretty wrapped up in her affair with Ethan to notice. Shifting gears, Lily suddenly inquired about the family business, looking for some reassurance. I informed her that the company was doing well, but we no longer owned it. She seemed oblivious, genuinely surprised, even as I'd finalized the deal months prior. Desperate, she asked if we were still wealthy, wanting to grasp what had changed while she was caught up with Ethan. I let her simmer for a bit, taking in just how out of touch she'd been. Then I finally told her that her share from the sale was enough to cover the mortgage on the house. She gawked, bewildered, and it was clear she hadn't realized there even was a mortgage. I explained that I'd put my portion of the sale towards something else, a 45-foot sailboat. I'd taken early retirement and planned to spend my days sailing wherever the tide took me. Her face twisted in anger, and she spat out her hatred for boats in the open sea. I acknowledged her disdain, clarifying there wouldn't be space for her on board anyway. The boat was built to fit just two, myself and a deckhand I'd recently hired. Lily pressed, oddly insistent, saying she could still join me, throwing out ideas about exploring the Mediterranean or cruising down to the south of France, fondly recalling her time there with Ethan the previous year. I stopped her right there, coolly informing her that the boat had only one cabin. Barely enough for two, I said. She narrowed her eyes, demanding to know where the deckhand would stay. I replied that the deckhand, a skilled 28-year-old French blonde named Tessa, had been sleeping with me for some time. Lily's face flushed with shock, and the tears started. I might have felt something once, but at that moment, all I felt was relief that it was over. The next day, I left for France to join my boat, where Tessa was waiting, leaving Lily in her stunned silence. My plan was finally coming to life, piece by piece. I hadn't bothered to mention the 6-bedroom villa I'd bought close to the harbor, with money saved from the company sale. The villa came with a lovely pool where Tessa and I could unwind, and where our friend Julia, who had an aversion to the top half of her bikini, liked to visit. Then there was the best part. My old Jaguar XK140, which I'd never sold, was parked safely in the villa's garage, waiting for me to take Tessa on a scenic drive down the coast. As for Ethan, the last I'd heard, he'd run into some rough luck. Mugged outside his favorite bar, he was left with 5 broken ribs, busted kneecaps, and a missing wallet. And let's just say he lost more than just cash that night. The tables had finally turned, closing the book on his so-called happy ending.